Are we ready for another chapter of Little Britches by Ralph Moody? We're here at the Caribou Public Library for our chapter book story time. Thanks for joining us. I'm Miss Erin, and we're going to be starting with chapter 28, Riding in the Roundup. Riding hayrake and stacker horse were kind of monotonous after being at the mountain ranch with Hi and the cattle. If it hadn't been for those evenings, I don't think I would have liked it at all. Before Hi went back to the mountains, he told me that I would have to ride sky high every night if I wanted him to remember all the things that I'd taught him during the spring, and that I ought to keep him in practice on cutting and roping by working on the young stock in the home pasture. There were about 20 men around the place during haying. 8 or 9 of them were cowhands who weren't needed with the stock through the summertime, and the rest were hands that Mr. Cooper had hired in Denver. All the cowhands were getting ready for the 4th of July roundup at Littleton. They always had roundups at the fairgrounds on 4th of July and Labor Day, and there were prizes for bronco busting, horse racing, trick riding, and roping. Mr. Cooper liked to have the YB fellows win prizes at the roundups, and kept 10 or a dozen outlaw horses at the home place so the men could keep in practice. I wanted to try to ride a couple of them. They didn't seem to buck as hard as Prince used to, but Mr. Cooper wouldn't let me, and every night he had one of the fellows ride with me when I was practicing with Sky High. Usually it was Tom Brogan. He wasn't very good at busting, but he could make a rope do some funny tricks. More funny tricks than a monkey on a grapevine. I learned to do some rope tricks from him. But he couldn't make his sorrel do tricks like High's Blue, and I never could seem to keep Sky in step with him. Mr. Cooper had High come in from the mountain ranch about the end of June, so he could get some practice on the outlaws before the roundup. And from then till the 4th, he practiced with me 3 or 4 hours a day. Mr. Cooper saw us riding together that first night after High came in from the mountains, and after that, he'd send Tom Brogan to ride the stacker horse at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I had all the rest of the day with High. There wasn't any haying on the 4th of July, and everybody went to the roundup early in the forenoon. I rode sky high, and I didn't have to stay in the grandstand either, like the other kids. High took me right out into the middle of the racetrack oval, where they had the bronco busting and bulldogging and calf roping. High won first prize in the bronco busting, and Tom Brogan in calf roping, but it was the trick riding that I liked best. One girl crawled clear around her horse, under his belly, and back into the saddle while he was on the dead run. Another one stood with her feet in loops of strap on the saddle pommel and rode all the way around the racetrack without losing her balance. And there were at least a dozen men riders who did all kinds of stunts, from going under a running horse to sliding off over one's tail and jumping back into the saddle. After everything else was over, the man with the megaphone shouted, "The last number on our program will be an exhibition of matched pair riding by Hi Beckman and Little Britches of the YB spread. Bring 'em out, Hi." Hi hadn't told me we were going to ride. Tom Brogan picked me up by one arm and the hind end of my chaps and tossed me into my saddle, but my legs were shaking so that I could hardly get my feet in the stirrups. Then somebody opened the gate and let us out onto the racing strip in front of the grandstand. It was a good thing I had had those few afternoons to ride with Hi, because I was so mixed up at first that Sky High pretty nearly had to do everything by himself. I didn't help him much until it came to the end, where we went up to the grandstand, changing lead, so it looked as if both horses were dancing. As we went up, Hi said, "Grab your hat off, Little Britches. When you see me, grab mine." I did, and the people in the stands yelled louder than they did when Fred Altland's boys won the trotting race. All I could think of was that I wished Father could have been there to hear it. All the YB fellows went uptown to Monahan's saloon as soon as the roundup was over, and I went with them. Sky High didn't like going up Main Street very well and kept bobbing his head and dancing, but it was the doctor's horseless carriage that really scared him. He crow-hopped right up onto the sidewalk in front of Schellenberger's Market, and he was still trembling when I left him ground-tied at the hitch rail by Monahan's. I was about as nervous as Sky High because I knew Mother wouldn't want me going into a saloon. Anyway, not unless I had to go in to see the sheriff. High sat me up on the middle of the bar. Lots of fellows came and shook hands with me and called me Little Britches and wanted to buy me a birch beer and sarsaparilla. but all the time I seemed to be hearing Mother's voice, as it was down there by the creek, when she recited, "So live that when thy summons comes." I had to talk about something to get that out of my head, so I said to Hi, "I'll bet we could do some stunts pretty near as good as those trick riders. I can do that diving trick and come up on my feet like you did when Mother and I were planting potatoes." Then I told him about practicing it in the sandy spot where I was herding Mrs. Corcoran's cows. When we got back to the home ranch, everyone wanted to see me do it, even Mr. Cooper, and I almost wished I hadn't said anything about it. With Fanny, I'd always done the diving stunt bareback, and she never spooked or changed direction when I was starting my dive. I knew that it would be a lot different to do it with a saddle, and was afraid that I might get a foot caught in a stirrup, or that Sky High might spook so that I'd land square on my head. I guess I was thinking about the same things. Anyway, he wouldn't let me try it until we went way out into the middle of a plowed field, and then he led Sky High the first couple of times. I hadn't tried the stunt since about a month before we lost Fanny. Sky didn't run very well in the plowed ground, so I kind of messed up the first couple tries. After that, High let me try it alone, and it went better. From there on to the end of August, I don't think that I always gave the man who was paying me a good day's work, the way Father told me to. I went back to the mountain ranch with the cattle, and we hardly got one cutting of alfalfa put up before another was ready to be started. But a couple of mornings every week, Mr. Cooper would say that he had to go up to the mountains to see how the cattle were getting along, and that I could go with him if I wanted to. Of course, I always wanted to, and Hi would spend 2 or 3 hours practicing stunts with me. There were only 2 of them that were hard to learn, and we practiced them both a dozen times whenever I went to the mountains, and on Saturday afternoons when Hi came to the home place. For one of them, Hi would have me stand facing him. Then he'd take Sky Blue back 100 yards and give him a good start and come pounding down past me. As he came, he'd lean over in the saddle and stick one arm out straight. I'd stick my arm out straight too. If I kicked my off leg up just at the instant that our arms met, and if we got a handhold on each other's arms, I'd go flying right up back of his cantle. The trouble was that I had to kick my leg up before our arms really came together. Whenever they missed, or we didn't get a good handhold, I'd turn a somersault without using my arms. My face got skinned up a little at first, but after a few days, I'd sail up back of the saddle nearly every try. The only other hard one was the one where Hi swung me. We practiced that one first with a jockey pole between the 2 horses' bridles, so that they would have to run side by side without any guiding. We tied our lines around the saddle horns, and when the horses were going lickety-cut, I'd put both arms over my head and lean toward Hi. He'd lean toward me, and with one arm looped over his head, we'd get a wrist hold. Then he'd jerk me out of my saddle and swing me over his head so that, at the top of the swing, I was doing a handstand at the end of his upstretched arms. I had to bounce and jump when my feet hit the ground on the off side of his horse, so that he could swing me back into my own saddle again. It wasn't nearly as hard as it was scary, and we only made 2 or 3 bobbles before it worked as smooth as a stream of warm milk. One thing that helped was that I weighed only 70 pounds. Of course, the big danger was that if the horses didn't stay side by side, there wouldn't be any saddle for me to come down into. After the first few days, though, both roans knew the trick just as well as we did. So from there on, we practiced without the jockey pole. At first, I didn't want to tell Father anything about our new tricks, or that Hi and I were planning to ride in the Labor Day roundup. I was afraid that he might say it was taking unnecessary chances. Every time I thought about it, I'd feel sneaky and remember about the day that I stole the chocolate bar, and what he said to me out there by the chopping block, and how much I liked to have him walk out to the gate with me and say, "So long, partner," when I went back to Cooper's Sunday nights. So I told him that first Saturday night after the 4th of July, before I even got the saddle off Sky High. I didn't tell him just what the tricks were, but I did say that Hi would look out that I didn't get hurt. Mother didn't want me to ride in the roundup, but I kind of think Father did. He didn't really tell me that I could until the last Sunday, and then he didn't really tell me. There was a paper that everybody had to sign before they could go into the contests. It was something about riding at your own risk, and I wasn't old enough to sign it, so Father would have to if I was going to ride. I didn't say a word about it, and he didn't either, until we were out milking that Sunday night. Then I heard the milk stop singing in his bucket, and he passed the paper to me down under Brindle's belly. All he said was, "You better ride on over to Cooper's tonight. I may want to get an early start in the morning." Always, when I went back to Cooper's on Sunday nights, I'd put Sky High in the big corral and go right on into bed. There was always a poker game going on in the bunkhouse, and Father didn't like me to hang around over there. It was just after dark when I got back that night, and there was only a dim light in the bunkhouse. After I'd hung up my saddle and started for the house, High called to me from the bunkhouse door. "Come on over here, Little Britches. Bill Engel left a box here for you." Bill Engel was the express driver to Morrison, but I couldn't imagine why he'd have left a box for me. When I got over there wasn't any poker game, and all 3 lanterns were turned down low. I thought High was all alone, but when I went through the door, fellows poured out of every bunk and started yelling, "Surprise! Surprise!" High grabbed me up in his arms, and Mr. Cooper turned up the lanterns. There was a big package sitting in the middle of High's bunk. It had Sears Roebuck in big printing across one corner, and the lettering on the tag was so big that I could see it before High got me halfway over there. It said, "Little Britches, in care of the YB Ranch, Littleton, Colorado." My hands were shaking, so I couldn't untie the strings, and High had to cut them with his knife. There was everything in that box that I ever hoped to have, and it was all just my size. There was a pair of mountain goat chaps with long white hair, a 10-gallon light tan hat, Spanish high-heeled boots with pointed toes, and a peach-colored silk shirt with a bright red neck scarf. I didn't find the silver spurs until High told me to look in the box again. It must have been 10 o'clock before the fellows got done making me try my things on and let me go to bed. And then I couldn't go to sleep for a long time. High took me to Littleton early Labor Day morning, and I wore all my new cowboy clothes. He wanted Sky High to get used to town noises and hearing the band play, so he wouldn't be nervous when it came our turn to ride. Sky spooked and crow-hopped little the first time that we rode up Main Street, and it took him quite a while to get used to the band. They hadn't had one of those at the 4th of July. By 11 o'clock, he had quieted down, so we put both roans in the livery stable while we went up to the hotel and had dinner. High had fixed it up with Father to meet us there, and when we came out after eating, our spring wagon was standing right in front of the hotel steps. Mother and all the youngsters were there, and I don't know when I was any more glad to see them all. I had hoped Father would come to see me ride, but I hadn't ever thought he'd bring the whole family clear down there. I knew Mother would have a fit if she ever knew what kind of stunts we were going to do, and I wasn't a bit sure Father would like it either. Of course, he'd asked me if I'd told him. Oh, and I'd have told him. Let me read that one again. Of course, if he'd asked me, I'd have told him, but he didn't ask. Each rider or team in the trick riding contest had to draw a number out of a hat to see when they would get their turn. We drew the highest number, so we had to be last. There were some real good tricks, a lot better than the 4th of July. The nearer it came to our turn, the more nervous I got, and I think I would have chewed all my fingernails off if High hadn't been standing right there beside me. I was sure we couldn't win one of the prizes with all those fancy trick riders, and once or twice I almost wished that something would happen so we wouldn't have to ride at all. Every nerve in me was singing like a telegraph line on a cold night. When the man with the megaphone hollered, "High Beckman and Little Britches on Sky Blue and Sky High, representing the YB spread." Then we rode out onto the racetrack. I couldn't help seeing how nervous I was. And the first 2 or 3 tricks we did were the easy ones that we had shown Father and Mother at home. I don't know when I got over being nervous, but after the easy tricks were finished, I forgot all about the grandstand being there. Trick riding doesn't take nearly as smart a fellow as most people think, but it does take smart horses, and we had them. Sky High and Sky Blue didn't make a misstep anywhere, and everything went as if we'd been practicing for years. We saved the dive trick for the end, and when we raced up toward the center of the grandstand, dived and bowed, it sounded as if all the Indians in the world were practicing war whoops together. I was lucky. I came clear over onto my feet, and my hat stayed on all the way. I swept it off the way Hi did when I bowed. Father must have thought that I was going to get hurt because he had come down from the grandstand, and when I looked around, I saw him standing by the track gate. I guess I forgot where I was, and about Hi, and Sky Blue, because I dropped my reins and went running down to him. I think I expected him to scoop me up in his arms the way he used to when I was only 6 or 7 years old. But he didn't. He just stuck out his hand and shook mine. Then he said, "Better get your horse, partner. I think the judges are going to call you." But his voice had that silver bell sound in it. I was nearly back to where Hi was bringing the horses when the man with the megaphone hollered, "First place in the trick riding contest? Hi, Beckman and Little Britches of the YB spread. Hi, bring Little Britches on over here to the judges' stand." Most of the men in both Arapahoe and Jefferson counties must have come over to the judges' stand while they were giving Hi and me our gold watches. And I shook so many hands that my arm ached. Mother was still wiping her eyes when Father and I went up into the grandstand to show her my watch. I guess it would have been better if I had told her a little more about our new tricks before we did them. Grace said that Mother thought I was going to get killed every minute and was scared nearly out of her wits. I let all the other youngsters, even Hal, hold my gold watch and listen to it tick. And after the bucking contest was over and Hi had won another watch, we all went up to the drugstore and Father bought everybody an ice cream soda. It was the first one I had ever had, and I liked it even better than birch beer or sarsaparilla. Grace and the other youngsters liked theirs too, and so did Father. But I think Hi would rather have had whiskey. Well, that's the end of Chapter 8. Thanks again for joining us today. The end of Chapter 28. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.